This happened back in the fall of either 2002 or 2003, when I was around 12 or 13, near Clinton Lake in Kansas on a Boy Scout campout. I still go backpacking and camping a lot, but this was the last camping trip I remember attending before moving states. We arrived at our campsite on a Friday and planned on staying through Saturday and leaving Sunday morning. I remember us having to set up our tents in the rain Friday evening, but Saturday was sunny and gorgeous. I don't remember every precise detail, but right before we went out to hike that morning, an old van, perhaps a late 70s model, pulled into a campsite within view of ours. These guys were hippies with a capital H, and that was my first exposure to what weed smells like. I remember I thought there was a skunk nearby. They were too far away for us to hear any specific conversations, but even the adult leaders found this to be a funny sight. One of them, I think, went over there to ask that they stop using drugs in front of us, or move to another site. When we got back from our day hike, they were still there. They were so baked they couldn't play their instruments with any skill. Now here's where it got weird. By the time the sun was setting, the group of stoners had completely ditched their hippie attire and had dressed in total goth style. Some had makeup that made their faces unnaturally pale. Others had black trench coats on, and they must have had a stereo, because all we could hear over there was grunge metal playing. That night after we cooked and ate dinner, all the scouts, including myself, headed out into an open area of the campgrounds to play Capture the Flag. We collectively established the boundaries, which was still pretty close to the group of now goths, but it gave us a different angle of view to their site. I doubt they had any idea we were there, since we played with no flashlights. By this point, the grunge metal had been replaced by this creepy, ominous opera music. I succumbed to curiosity, but I wasn't about to sneak into their campsite. I just crept a little closer to see what they were doing. They had made a large campfire, beyond legal limits, and I couldn't see any of the group. On a tree, I saw something that initially freaked me out, but I figured that it couldn't be real. And these people are out here all stoned, or maybe on all kinds of other drugs, so I continued to play. I think we only played one game, then retired to our tents. At some point in the middle of the night, all of our adult leaders woke us up and told us to quickly and quietly pack up our things, take down our tents, and get back to the bus. As we were packing everything up, we couldn't help but notice the bonfire was still going strong, but the music had stopped and we heard people talking. The tone didn't sound like casual conversation either, but I couldn't hear specific words. I don't know how to describe it. Once everyone and everything was on the bus, the driver got us the hell out of there. The adults were abnormally quiet, and the scouts had congregated to the back of the bus. I don't remember if one of us told the adults about those guys, but we knew the reason we left was because of them. A fellow scout from the other CTF team had also tried to sneak into their campsite and saw the same thing I did. Ever since, I'm inclined to think that what we saw was real, and the reason for us cutting the trip short. Hanging from a tree, he and I saw a decapitated dog and 2 severed human legs. I never learned anything more about that night. I live in a rural area of southwestern Ontario, and I've lived here all my life. There's about 5 or 6 closely knit farm towns in the county. This one is less of a farm town, and more known for its relationship with the beginning of the oil industry. I'd name it, but the population is small, and I'd rather not share many identifying factors. Quite a few weird things have happened to me during my life here, but this one takes a big chunk of the cake. The street I currently live on extends fairly far from the town center to the fields outside of town. About 3/4 down that street from my apartment is a clearing which takes you down to a creek where rainwater drains into. In high school, I was a bit of a shady kid, smoking pot in the woods with friends and all that good stuff. One day while walking with my cousin and his friend, They decided we should sneak down to the drainage pipe and sit on the rocks to smoke. It was roughly 9:30 p.m., and I'd like to say it was June, so it was just starting to get dark. I figured whatever, nobody's gonna see us. It's better than doing nothing, and followed them down. On the way down the hill towards the creek, my cousin's friend pointed out a random chair placed in some bushes. It was old, like 70s era, with the flower print vinyl seat and metal frame. Definitely looked weird in that setting. It felt like we'd only been there for 2 minutes, when it was suddenly completely dark, and I started to get a very uneasy feeling. One of those, I should probably get the fuck out of here feelings. I started telling them I wanted to go, but they insisted on taking one more toke each. I passed on any more, in case it was just the weed making me paranoid. But soon enough, I'd learn it wasn't just me. They finally finished up, packed everything away, and we started heading back to the clearing exit. It seemed extremely, eerily quiet, despite having a drainage pipe gushing water exactly where we had been sitting. We'd only been walking for about a minute when I hear my cousin stop and whisper, "What the?" So out of curiosity, I turned around. I regretted that instantly. Some abnormally tall figure was standing directly behind the chair I mentioned earlier. But it wasn't like your plain old spooky tall hooded guy. It was more creepy, lanky, like straight out of a horror flick. It didn't move whatsoever, but apparently all three of us had the same thought and just took off running towards the clearing. I tripped on something, but it was too dark to see what. Thankfully, my cousin heard me trip and wasn't selfish enough to just abandon me there while he got the hell out. He pulled me to my feet aggressively while telling me not to turn around, and just kept dragging me toward the exit. Once we got back to proper civilization, I felt 100% safer for about 2 minutes. About a block away from the clearing, we stopped to catch our breath in front of some houses and streetlights, because if it was just some dickhead who was just screwing with us in the woods, he obviously wouldn't continue antagonizing us if people could catch him. That was when we decided to look back, for whatever dumb fucking reason, and saw the same lanky thing standing a few feet behind the street lamp nearest the clearing. It was almost ethereal, like the light didn't shine through it, but it also cast no shadows. We took off running downtown to the main street, and a wave of relief washed over the three of us. I had them walk me home since I was scared shitless, but that really wasn't the end of it. I couldn't sleep at all that night, not without borrowing some Xanax from my grandmother. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I had to close all the curtains and blinds in the house because I was so afraid of seeing that figure outside, and that anxiety haunted me for months afterwards. I don't think I was just seeing things that night, and I genuinely feel like if my cousin hadn't noticed me fall, I might not have got out of there. I told my family that someone had followed us, rather than trying to explain how non-human they seemed. I felt like nobody would believe me anyway, and they'd assume it was just me being a dumb stoner making up stories. I've actually been stalked by someone before, and it was nothing like whatever the hell happened there that night. I'm just really glad I wasn't alone. I'm finally going to sit down and write out the tale of Charlie, the one-armed homeless guy. I know that sounds like a ridiculous title, but it's the best thing I can come up with. This story takes place about 15 years ago, during a summer that I still consider to be one of the most formative times of my life. It was the summer between junior high and high school, and a lot of things changed for me. I tried pot for the first time. I had some of my first experiences with girls. And I met Charlie. Let me give you some more of the backdrop so that you can understand what comes after. I had a large group of friends at this time, and most of us would meet up after school to hang out for a few hours. These sessions would consist of anywhere from 5 to 10 kids, and we'd usually all chip in for snacks and drinks, then go to a park that was in our area and hang out. We'd smoke weed. Sometimes there was booze, and we'd play games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! It was a good group of kids. We weren't out to cause trouble. There were girls as well as guys, ages varying from 13 to 17. We just liked to hang out and have fun. These sessions spilled over into our summer days and became long, protracted hours spent laughing hysterically or arguing over the rules of a particular game. It was on one of those days, about 2 weeks into summer, that we first met Charlie. Now, we'd frequently have homeless people in the park while we were there. Our usual outpost was the jungle gym. We'd basically take it over and sit in the middle. But if there were kids who actually wanted to play at the park, we'd go down to the picnic tables. If there were homeless people, they'd be at the tables too, and so we occasionally had to interact with them. Typically, the homeless people in the area were one of two types, drunk or on drugs, occasionally both. The drunk ones usually made inappropriate comments at one of the girls, but took off when they saw how many of us there were. The ones who were on drugs, well, we learned to spot the signs of that early on, and we avoided them. Charlie looked to be the first kind when we met him. He was definitely drunk, and smelled like stale piss, beer, and cigarettes. He was about 5'8", and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. He looked to be in his late 50s and sported a huge, scraggly beard. Beady eyes with the kind of glimmer peeked out from under his brow, and he always wore the same stain-streaked teal sweatshirt. But the thing that stuck out about Charlie right off the bat, the thing that would go on to define how we thought about Charlie, was that he only had one arm. He was missing his right, all the way up to the shoulder. Sometimes he would tie up the sleeve of his sweater, and sometimes he would let it flap around in the breeze. We saw him sitting at one of the concrete tables one day, and we knew that he was new to the area because we would have remembered seeing a one-armed guy. He was sitting on the bench, facing forward, but with his head lying on the table. It looked like he'd passed out there, and there were some vodka shooters strewn about, so we figured he was just another run-of-the-mill drunk. One of our guys, a 14 or 15-year-old named Jake, decided to toss an empty Mountain Dew can at the guy. Now, we didn't generally do stuff like that, but there were a couple among us who were known to try to cause trouble now and then. Jake was one of those, and when it happened, we did our best to contain it and mitigate it. But he cocked back and chucked the can before anyone could stop him, and of course his aim was true enough that day. The empty can hit the guy right in the back of the head, and he shook awake suddenly. We heard him grumbling, and we all whispered quiet daggers at Jake, chastising him for the dick move. Jake laughed to himself, but I could see he was watching with just a bit of worry, wondering what the guy would do. He got slowly to his feet and turned around, looking at us. He grumbled a question which I'm sure just amounted to, "What the fuck, man?" One of the girls stood up, leaning against the railing of the jungle gym. "We're sorry, mister. Our friend's an asshole," she said, giving him a pitiful smile. He just grumbled again, used his one arm to grab his backpack from under the table, and walked slowly out of the park. That was the first time we saw Charlie. It turned out that we'd see him a lot more over the coming weeks, and he began to frequent the park. Perhaps we collectively still felt like assholes over what Jake had done to him, or perhaps it was the fact that he only had one arm, but we kind of took him under our wing. Every day after school, when we'd gather up our meager funds to get some soda and chips, we'd grab something for Charlie. Sometimes it would be a big 2-liter of Coke. Other times it would be a loaf of bread or a honey bun. Whatever we could afford to do while still getting ourselves something. Kid logic dictated that this was fair. Charlie would often be drunk, but during the days when he was sober, he would tell us about his life. He claimed to have traveled most of the United States and said that he was a veteran of the war. When asked about which war and when, Charlie would give vague answers which resembled remarks about World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Take your pick. We chalked it up to Charlie just being a little bit crazy. He once regaled us with the story of a time he'd gotten into a knife fight with a guy who had only one eye. We were roaring with laughter at the prospect of a one-armed guy and a one-eyed guy knife fighting with each other. It was ridiculous. It was Charlie. None of us ever worked up the stones to ask him about his arm, though. We all felt the question hanging there every time we talked to him. What had happened to Charlie's arm? But no one ever found it within themselves to ask. It took Charlie being grand slam wasted, I mean barely conscious, to get the few pieces of the story we'd ever get. We found him sitting against the base of the jungle gym one day, and he had a mostly empty 40-ounce beer in his lap and another empty one beside him. He'd probably scored a few bucks from a sympathetic passerby and gone off immediately to get the booze. Since Charlie would often go days without eating, the beer hit him hard. He was mumbling to himself as we pulled him over to one of the tables. We got an empty plastic bottle from the ground, rinsed it out, and filled it up with water. One of the girls kind of splashed some on his face, and we got him to drink a few gulps. One of the guys left around that time to go get a loaf of bread, I remember. Something about bread soaking up the alcohol. It took about 20 minutes of getting him to take small gulps of water before he started to regain some semblance of a conscious state. He was very, very drunk and constantly mumbling to himself. We started to be able to pick out actual words, though, and this is what he was mumbling.
My arm. The army. Lost my arm in the army.
Over and over, just like that. Lost my arm in the army. My arm. My arm. Arm. Army. Lost my arm in the army. We were all a little weirded out by this, but this was Charlie after all. He was a weird guy, but he was harmless. The boy who'd gone to get the bread returned, and we fed him a piece bit by bit between gulps of water.
Took my arm, they did. That thing. It took my arm in the army,
Charlie murmured, his chin against his chest. We all looked at each other warily.
In the army. They got my arm. It took it. It took it right on through. Almost got me too. Almost got me. Got my arm in the army.
Charlie's head lolled to the side, and Sheila, a 16-year-old girl that all of us were happy to steal glances at when we could, propped it back in place. Charlie was almost asleep then, but he said one more thing before he was out. One more thing that I wasn't sure if I'd even heard correctly, until quite some time later. He said,
Got my arm, they did. And now they found me again. Yes, they did. Got my arm and found me now.
Like I said, Charlie passed out after that, and that was the most detail we ever got about Charlie, and it freaked us all out. We kind of collectively decided to pretend it didn't happen, but even right after, I could tell that things were different. The summer ended not long after that incident. I went into high school, and promptly got preoccupied with smoking weed and looking at boobs of all shapes and sizes. Some members of the group drifted away, and others joined. We still went to the park after school every day, and we still saw Charlie. We still gave him things when we could, and tried to make sure he had some basic supplies like soap and toilet paper as well. Now this next part is sort of graphic, but I said I was going to tell this as it happened, and I intend to do that. I don't like to remember this because it still creeps into my nightmares to this day. About halfway through my freshman year of high school, a friend and I decided to ditch and walk down the nearby flood wash. This wash ran adjacent to the road where our park was located, and it was also a place we knew Charlie would often sleep. We figured we'd go find him and smoke him out. Maybe we'd get a good homeless guy story out of him. As we neared the spot we'd usually find him, we became aware of a powerful odor, a foul, deep smell which you never forget. It was the smell of death. The spot Charlie liked to sleep was the entrance of a small tunnel that allowed water to flow under a main road above. He would sleep in the entrance there, tucked away safely, and in a spot where few other homeless people ever went. It was there that we found Charlie's body. We knew right away that he was dead, and I remember thinking that he must have been out in the heat for at least a day or two already. There were flies buzzing around him, and his eyes were bulging. I remember those eyes because they seemed to stare at me. We stood there in shock at the scene before us. It wasn't his eyes which horrified us, though. It wasn't his swollen skin turning black and purple in some spots. It was his throat. Charlie's throat was torn open. His body lay inside of the tunnel, but his one arm and head were dangling out over the edge. His throat was a mess, ripped wide and jagged, exposing muscle, tissue, and tendons. I've never seen an injury like that before, even in a movie. I nearly wet myself, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. My friend threw up, and I promptly concurred. We ran away screaming, and we were both crying when we got into a store which was across the street from the tunnel. Police were called, and we were both questioned extensively. Eventually it was ruled a homicide, and the detectives told us that this kind of thing happened amongst the homeless sometimes. They never explained the excessive violence, though. It's not the issues with the police work that bother me. The thing that gives me nightmares is when I remember what that wound looked like. I've since done research, and I've seen that wounds like his, jagged flesh dangling in clumps like Charlie's was, are typically caused by large animals of prey. And I remember what Charlie said that day, when he was so drunk he couldn't even hold his head up.
Got my arm, they did. And now they found me again. Yes, they did. Got my arm and found me now.
I don't know what got Charlie's arm in the army, but I saw his body. And now, when I remember that long, ragged tear in his throat, I can't help but agree with Charlie. It found him again. When I was very young, probably between the ages of 3 and 4, I had an imaginary friend. It was an older woman who wore a babushka. I would often describe her to my family as the witch from Snow White. As a child, that character would terrify me to the point I couldn't even look at the screen whenever she was on. We had a playroom of sorts in the back of the house. This room had a sliding glass door which led out to the deck. I would often see her walking up my deck steps towards this door and be terrified. However, once she got to the door and entered the playroom, I'd no longer have fear. Even though she was ugly and resembled a character I feared, I felt kindness and sincerity from her. She would play games with me. I was a lonely kid, specifically Connect 4. I became quite used to her presence. I would see her walking through my yard from the other windows in the house, and excitedly run to the playroom to meet her. My fear of her was gone, and she would always just come inside and play with me for a bit, and then leave and disappear. I would talk to my family about my friend, and they would tease me, assure me it was just my imagination, etc. This went on for maybe a year until I just stopped seeing her. For a few years after, my family would occasionally bring it up and tease me, but eventually we all kind of just forgot about it. Fast forward to my high school days, and to understand this story better, let me describe the layout of my house. My living room has a sofa against one wall, and against another wall is an oversized chair-type sofa with an ottoman. Whenever a friend stayed over, one of us would sleep on the sofa, and the other one on the big chair. From the chair, you can see the sliding back door I mentioned earlier. The old playroom was now converted into a dining room. So one night, my friend Krista stayed over. I was sleeping on the chair and she was on the couch. It was a typical teenage night. Had a wine cooler or two, maybe smoked some weed, stayed up late watching TV. Now this is where it gets weird. The next day when we wake up, Krista tells me about a dream or a waking dream she had. She said in this dream she woke up, but was laying on the big chair and not the couch like in reality. We had switched positions essentially. She then looks over to the back door and sees an old woman with a scarf wrapped around her head, looking through the glass at her. She then said she kind of knocked and waved at her, and then my friend woke up. When she told me this dream in the morning, I immediately got a knot in my stomach. I had pretty much forgotten about my imaginary friend, and had definitely never told her the story. It was so bizarre the way she described it, like how we were in opposite spots, and how she saw her through that door. I told my mom the story too. She kind of got silent and didn't really want to talk about it. She is a huge skeptic of paranormal stuff. As creepy as it is, I sort of feel like maybe this woman is somehow looking over me. Krista turned out to be not so good of a friend, and as scary as this woman looked, she was never malevolent to me at all. Any thoughts on what this woman may be would be appreciated. Not my story, but a friend of the family's. We'll call him Mike. He is more like an uncle and was close with my father. Mike told me this story on one of his more drunken nights. I think he regrets telling me, because the last time I stupidly brought it up, he quickly changed the subject. I later learned he hadn't even told my father, and they are close. I got enough details to get the full story, and permission from Mike to tell it, with name changes. So from Mike to me, here it is. It was the day that Mike's family was supposed to be out of the house, a weekday. Mike had a sister, Sarah, and a brother, Tom. They lived with their parents in a suburb in an average 2-story house with a security system installed. Mike's father and mother worked early, but his father would get home around 2 and be able to finish paperwork at home. Before this had occurred, Mike's parents had been arguing with Mike and his sister for leaving school before lunchtime, as Sarah was a senior and already drove, and Mike had just started driving himself to school and back. In an attempt to dissuade this and keep them from coming back to the house, their parents kept the code to the security system a secret. During the week, Mike's father would come home at 2 and be able to disarm it before any of the kids got home. Of course, in emergency situations, they would give out the code and then change it. This didn't stop them. Mike would still come home, as he learned he could open a window near the kitchen without setting off the system. He informed his sister of this, and his little brother overheard them talking. Tom was in middle school and never really ratted on his big siblings, so Mike didn't mind that Tom knew he was still sneaking home in the hours before their dad would return. For a few months, it worked perfect. Mike and Sarah would drive to school, sneak off after first period when they were sure the house was clear, and then come home. Mike would smoke weed. Sarah would bring friends over, and they would go to lunch anywhere they wanted. They would even drop off lunch for Tom from time to time. They would try to space out days between doing this to avoid too many absences. One day, Mike decides he's going to skip second period and go pack his bong. He drives home, creaks open the window by the kitchen, goes upstairs and rips one up. As he's sitting in his room blowing smoke out the window, he hears a creaking sound. He pauses for a few seconds, before realizing it's the window he had been using to gain entry to the house. He was completely stoned, but the adrenaline of knowing someone was in the house quickly sobered him up. He hadn't heard a car pull in, and he knew Sarah had to be in second period that day for some presentation. Tom was always at school, and his parents rarely came home, and of course they wouldn't use the window. He said he felt completely frozen, and then he heard the intruder searching through drawers in the kitchen and in his parents' room downstairs. Instinctively, Mike had locked his door while smoking, and the only thing he could think to do was call the police. So he made as little noise as possible, got under his bed, and dialed 911. The intruder was downstairs and Mike was upstairs. He just hoped he didn't smell the weed smoke or hear the operator's voice. He was able to describe the situation and give the operator his address, and she told him to stay on the line. He could still hear the intruder rummaging, and he froze again as he heard footsteps coming up the stairs. His brother's room was right next to the stairs, and the intruder made his way in, again rummaging. Mike whispered to the operator that they were in the room right next to his. The operator said to keep the door locked and to stay hidden and silent. The police were on the way. The rummaging continued for a long time and made its way into Tom's closet, which was the closest part of Tom's room to Mike's. Then Mike describes a sound he at first thought was a very hoarse cough. He quickly assumed the intruder had smoked something in the house and was getting high while looting the place. After the cough, he heard almost a thrashing, a lot of commotion, much more than before. Mike assumed whatever drug the person had done had really hyped them up, possibly meth. He tensed up as he realized that the intruder might start charging down the hall and possibly break in his thin door. He said little more than "I'm here" to the operator in the lowest voice he could. The thrashing continued, and he heard several more heavy wheezes and coughing sounds. He said it didn't sound human. It was almost zombie-like. Then there was silence. Complete silence. Still frozen, Mike said he kept talking to the operator from under the bed for an additional 15 minutes before he heard the police storm the house from the front door. The intense beeping of the security system filled the air, and Mike called out down to the police. He went and unlocked his door and then sat on the edge of the bed. As the cops approached upstairs and cleared each room, Mike was surprised he didn't hear a struggle in any of them, especially Tom's. After the police entered Mike's room and cleared him, he was informed that there was no monster in the room next door, no drug-fueled homeless man, not even an intruder at all. They asked him who occupied the room next to his, and Mike told him his brother did. The police looked at each other as the air cleared. Mike's brother Tom had stayed at a neighbor's house for the first part of the day that day. He came home after he was sure his parents were gone. Then he got a rope from downstairs and hanged himself in his closet, directly adjacent to Mike's room. Tom was on the larger side and got picked on pretty frequently at school. Mike had sat there and listened to his brother hang himself, and remained as quiet as a mouse. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Send your story or creepypasta to the email in the description. My shirts, Patreon, Instagram, and Twitter are down there too. So I know that some people won't like the theme of this video, but this is my channel and I do whatever the fuck I want. I did want to say though, first of all, that I'm not your fucking dad to tell you that you shouldn't be doing this or shouldn't be doing that. But what I would like to say is that you need to decide for yourself the things that you want to do. Don't do shit because other people do it. You know, don't be a follower. I would also say, though, that, I know I said I'm not your dad, but I would also say that, beer and weed is enough. Heroin might be the greatest thing ever, but I'll never know because I'm not fucking stupid enough to do it. So, be good to animals, even people, soon.
Scout, snämmat, bergsbes, hreish.
Emergency? Yeah, can you please send rescue? I think I'm having an overdose at the store with my wife.
Okay, you and your wife?
Yes.
Overdose of what?
Marijuana. I think we're dying.
Okay, how much did you guys have?
I don't know, we made brownies, and I think we're dead. Time is going by really, 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 really slow.